Hi guys, so today I wanted to cover the material for analysis in chapter 16 of the Dressmaker, and again we'll be focusing our analysis on how it can be compared with the Crucible. So here's a quick summary of chapter 16. We see the Beaumont's fundraiser coming up and the preparations that they make for the fundraiser. We see the opening of the fundraiser with the women wearing Tilly's dresses. And also Mona is caught in an unfortunate misunderstanding which leads her to be forced to marry Leslie. It's implied here in this chapter, and it's later confirmed, that Evan Pettyman is Tilly's benefactor who allowed her to study outside of Dungatar. So it's quite a long chapter, but it's actually quite heavy in terms of filler, so a lot of it isn't really necessary to understand for your analysis. So this part isn't important for your analysis, but I'm just going to establish the subtext here. So when Ruth delivers the mail and she says, oh yes, Tilly has all kinds of feathers in that trunk, she automatically kind of has this reaction where her hand flew to her mouth. And that's because she kind of exposed herself there. She realizes that she just let slip that she goes through Tilly's mail. We also see Tilly talking to Sergeant Farrett, and she says, it's amazing what a little nourishment will do. So there's this kind of veiled reproach there, which means that she's almost kind of saying, hey, you didn't do enough, but she's not quite saying it. So basically what she's saying is that the people of the town did nothing to help Molly despite the fact that she'd gone mad. And in response, Farrett says, oh, I thought that May McSweeney was supposed to look after her. So we see here that the reproach doesn't just fly over his head. So once again, we're not really led to believe that he's as unintelligent as the rest of the townspeople. Now, when Farrett sees Tilly's packages arrive and he knows what's in them, you can kind of look at this entire section that starts with he tore viciously to appalled at his abandonment. And in the ugly book that I am working from, it's on pages 147 to 148. So the reason why we see the use of certain words like lasciviously, wow, I really said that wrong the first time, as well as words like tore, it's because it's this kind of idea that he's freeing his repressed desires. And we'll get into that more here. So the two texts kind of both have their depictions of catharsis in response to oppression and repression. So catharsis is a Greek word, and it is essentially the release of pent-up emotions. So in the Dressmaker, we see repression of memories in the case of Tilly. So you know when you see the memories cut off, now we've talked about that a little bit with the theory of omission. So it's talking about the cutting off of memories as well, because her memories are kind of slowly revealed to us because that's the pace at which she can accept them and work through them. Now repression is less obvious in the Dressmaker as opposed to the Crucible, because the characters have their own vices that they keep somewhat private, but they still give into. So yes, they understand that their vices aren't socially acceptable, but they still give in to them because they know that others won't openly confront them about their secrets because everyone in that town has their own little secret. Obviously, we have the one exception of Beulah Harradine, who feels the need to tell everybody's business. But also, I think people don't take her quite too seriously. So, there's also this idea in both texts that the oppressed will fight back and get their revenge. So we will talk about revenge later in terms of the two texts. I'm thinking of covering it when I get to the brocade section. But basically, there is a difference between the types of oppression that we see in the Dressmaker and the Crucible. So in the Dressmaker, there is obviously still systemic oppression, but it's the kind of oppression that we witness the most is this kind of informal oppression that is enforced by the people themselves. It's that kind of gossip, the social exclusion, and um, the attitude that they have towards certain outsiders and certain people who they believe to be outsiders. Now, in the Crucible, oppression is systemic. So we see it with women and how they're treated unfairly, how they can't own their property, how they are essentially tied to their husbands. But here's the thing, even though it's set up in terms of the historical context, it's not really the focus of the text. But nonetheless, we see the kind of repression and the catharsis of built up emotion that is a result of that oppression. We see that in the repetition at the end of Act 1 and during the court scenes when the girls accuse people and they say things like, I'm cold, or I fear, or I can't, as well as I saw so and so with the devil. And the suspense that we see that's never quite dispelled. So it's built up and it keeps building up, but it's never quite dispelled. And we see that really well done at the end of Act 1. I know I reference that specific moment a lot, but that's because it is just really masterful writing where they have these moments of repetition that just escalate, and then all of a sudden the curtain drops, so there isn't this sense of resolution. So why is it important to think about catharsis of these built-up emotions that come from oppression and repression, as opposed to just thinking about it in terms of revenge? Well, revenge is something that you should be talking about in your essays, but this kind of takes it to the next level, because it's important to think of it in terms of how the writers build up their kind of plot and how they express their ideas, because that's really what this area of study is about. It's all about how the authors have constructed their texts to get ideas across. So when you think about what a crucible is essentially, um, the best way I would describe it is that it's a chemical or scientific or alchemical pressure cooker, essentially. And we see this kind of build up in that repetition, that kind of sense of pressure. And in The Dressmaker, we see it because Tilly's kind of memories of her suffering come back bit by bit rather than coming back to her at the very start and us seeing it from the start. And the fact that it comes back to us in bits and pieces is important because it creates this sense of build up. It creates this sense of look how much she's had to put up with, and then there's this final moment where she kind of fights back against it, because there's this sense of it all accumulating until there's this one straw that breaks her back, I guess, figuratively. Now, in chapter 16, we also see Sergeant Farrett, after he has this little episode of wild abandon where he goes through Tilly's mail, where Tilly asks him in response to it, how do you feel about ruffs and flounces? So she doesn't question that he likes to sew. She doesn't question his kind of failure to conform with gender norms. And in doing so, she's the one character who we see as truly progressive at this point. And what's ironic about this is that she wasn't invited to the gathering for quote-unquote progressive women, which was just mentioned one chapter ago. So we also see Trudy and, Gertrude and Muriel hanging out at Windswept Crest. That is a tongue twister. I might put up a video of me trying to say Windswept Crest for 1 minute straight from the last video. But the subtext when it says Trudy looked about her nervously is that she's worried about her mum embarrassing her in front of all of her new fancy relatives, and But what's really important here is that despite the fact that Muriel doesn't look put together, she's actually not as embarrassing as Gertrude, because Muriel is actually self-conscious. She makes a choice to live the lifestyle that she lives because she wants to get away from pretentious people. She just wants to live a simple and unpretentious life. So what she does is a conscious choice. Now, in Gertrude's case, she has this lack of self-awareness where she doesn't understand that she's not, well-born and well-connected. She's just married into a family which is actually quite impoverished, but likes to believe or put up a front of being, basically well-connected or, wealthy. Now, we see a couple of references to Trains and Hamish, as well as Faith cheating again. I don't think that these references are that important for your analysis. If anything, I guess you could talk about how this is a good example of how obsessed Hamish is with this idea of a small, romantic, idyllic country town where he has a little model of it. But yeah, it's really not that important for your analysis. Now, once again, we see a couple more references to Leslie being homosexual, how he knows what a cowl neckline is, how he squealed, and how he teaches Mona how to walk with deportment. He says, now hold your shoulders back and walk like I showed you. So he's demonstrating feminine gait to her. So we also see Teddy when he arrives to see Tilly, and he's wearing, Levi's jeans and, clean clothing and a studded leather jacket, I believe. So we see him adapting the way that he dresses for Tilly because he can see that physical presentation in terms of how you dress is actually quite important to her. And we see Tilly also opening up to him in response. So we see this healthy emotional development, this compromise, this adaptation, and we kind of have no choice but to stand, because so far in this text, their relationship is really the only one that's being presented as healthy. Now, that being said, their relationship at this point has not taken on a sexual dimension, and I would argue that their relationship doesn't have to take on a sexual dimension in order to be healthy. But what's interesting is that there's a parallel to be made with the Crucible in this specific case, because we see that in a lot of the other romantic relationships in this text. The sexual dimension of their relationship is central to how the relationship works, or the dynamic of the relationship. But for them, this is the one relationship that's actually quite similar to the relationships in the Crucible, where because of the Puritan kind of social norms, literally Puritan social norms of Salem, the sexual dynamic of a relationship is never really explored unless it's being explicitly made to feel transgressive, like in the case of Abigail and Proctor. So Molly asks Teddy, "You think you're good looking, don't you?" Now that's a reference to Mummy Dearest, which is a film, kind of like a highly embellished documentary film about the life of Joan Crawford, but it puts quite a negative spin on who she was because it's told by her daughter, essentially, who was abused by her. But anyway, so in Mummy Dearest, Joan Crawford is kind of depicted as this mad woman. So yes, she's high functioning, but she's also this psychopathic, sociopathic woman who will stop at nothing to get what she wants and has no sense of sympathy or love for a child. So there's this kind of idea of madness being mirrored here, the madness of Molly and the madness of Joan Crawford. But obviously Molly was not absent in Tilly's life as a result of a personal choice, or as a result of something that stemmed within her. It was a result of external causes. Now, obviously, you wouldn't say that someone who's mentally ill chose to be mentally ill, but in the case of Joan Crawford, she made active choices, and and those choices resulted in her being abusive towards her daughter. And the cause of that was internal, as opposed to something being, externally imposed upon her. They also mention the film Sunset Boulevard. So that's a film, again, about madness, and it foreshadows that the women will be the demise of the men in the film. And basically, Sunset Boulevard is all about a woman named Norma who used to be a movie star, and she falls in love with this young man who she kind of forces to work on a screenplay for her to make her big return. And when that doesn't work out, she shoots him. At the very end, there's something very haunting about it that comes back to Molly again, where she doesn't quite play by the same rules as the rest of society, because the police show up to arrest her for murdering a man, but instead of understanding the gravity of the situation, she has this delusion about all the camera crews around her being there for her to shoot her big return to the big screen. So that's where we get the iconic line, I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille. So I won't include clips of that here because, as I learned from my last video, movie clips get copyright strikes, and I'm not about that. So yeah, it foreshadows that the women will be the demise of the men because in the movie Sunset Boulevard, Norma shoots Joe, and in this movie, Tilly essentially destroys the lives of the men who deserve it most. Now here it's implied that Evan Pettyman is the benefactor that we've heard about, but it's confirmed later. And later on in the novel, when she says that she'll pay him back, you see that there's a double meaning here. So when she says she'll pay back her benefactor, she's actually saying, I am going to destroy him because he destroyed me. So that is the end of the chapter. Thanks for watching, and I hope you guys learned something. I'll see you guys next time.